You say you're tired, and maybe you are. But let us be precise. The weariness many of you feel is not merely the result of physical exertion, nor even the consequence of too many demands placed upon your time. No, this tiredness runs deeper, as if the soul itself has grown heavy. It is not the kind of fatigue cured by sleep, or by a weekend away, or even a change in scenery. It is the kind of exhaustion that persists in silence, even when the body is at rest. And because it is so easily misunderstood, even by the one experiencing it, it is often misnamed, misjudged, and misdiagnosed. But we must give it its proper name if we are ever to be free of it. You see, what we call tired is often a disguise, a polite word for something we dare not speak aloud, a quiet despair, a dull ache of living a life out of step with the inner truth of who we are. When the outer life no longer reflects the inner life, a tension forms, a contradiction that seeps into every part of our being. And like all contradictions, it creates a psychic split. The soul, sensing the falseness, retreats. It begins to whisper, at first gently, then more urgently. But if the voice is not heard, the body begins to speak in its own language. Restlessness, fatigue, emptiness. Many of us walk around with these symptoms and convince ourselves that what we need is more rest, more discipline, more motivation. We tell ourselves that we are weak, that we should try harder, that if we could only get it together, this heaviness would lift. But this is a cruel misunderstanding. For how can one be expected to thrive in an environment that does not nourish the self? How can one feel light while carrying the burden of inauthenticity? In my work, I have seen how the psyche rebels against such conditions. It does not tolerate a life that betrays the true self without consequence. And so, what appears as tiredness is actually the weight of unlived life pressing down upon us. The dreams deferred, the truths unspoken, the path not taken. This fatigue is not laziness. It is grief. It is mourning for the parts of ourselves we had to silence in order to survive. We live in a time where everything is accelerated. We are encouraged to produce, to perform, to keep moving. Stillness is mistaken for stagnation. Reflection is deemed indulgent. And so, we continue forward, even when something within us is begging to stop. But one cannot outrun the self. No matter how fast you move, you carry your truth with you. And if you do not listen, it will find other ways to be heard. This is why people find themselves crying without knowing why. This is why laughter feels hollow, why moments of success feel strangely empty, why we dread the quiet hours. It is because there is a gap between the life we live and the life that wants to live through us. And that gap becomes a chasm over time. The longer we ignore it, the more energy it takes to maintain the illusion that everything is fine. To name this correctly is to begin to heal. To say, I am not just tired. I am burdened by a life that feels foreign to my nature, is not weakness. It is the beginning of strength. It is the soul reclaiming its voice. But be warned, once that voice is heard, it will not be silenced again. The unconscious does not forget what the conscious mind tries to dismiss. There is a peculiar kind of honesty required here. An honesty that does not flinch in the face of discomfort. For to admit that we are not where we wish to be is a painful reckoning, but it is also the threshold of transformation. The soul does not ask for perfection, it asks for integrity. It asks that our outer life not be at odds with our inner truth. That is the only true rest there is. So when you feel that heaviness in your bones, that fog behind your eyes, that slow ache that no nap can soothe, ask yourself not how tired you are, but what it is that you are carrying. And more importantly, who told you that you had to carry it. It is not tiredness. It is something much older, much deeper, and far more sacred. There is a profound tragedy in the way many people come to inhabit their lives. As if by accident, not with intention, but by inertia. Not by deliberate choice, but by quit surrender. They follow paths laid out for them not by inner calling, but by external demand. By parents, by society, by circumstance. And while the world may applaud them for doing what is expected, something within them grows quieter with each passing year. Something essential begins to dim. I have seen many souls arrive at the threshold of suffering not because of trauma in the traditional sense, but because they have lived too long in roles they never truly chose. They became the caretaker because it was needed, the achiever because it was praised, the reliable one because someone had to be. They built lives that appeared stable, even successful, but only on the surface. Beneath it all, they could feel the architecture was hollow. We are born into systems. Family systems, cultural systems, economic systems. And each of these carries with it a hidden script, a script that says, this is what it means to be good. This is what it means to be worthy. This is how you must behave to be accepted. And so we play the part, often without knowing we have entered a performance. We become the version of ourselves that fits the script, unaware that we are gradually stepping further and further away from our authentic nature. What makes this so insidious is that it happens slowly, subtly. There is no moment of betrayal you can point to. Instead, there is a quiet accumulation of compromises, 1,000 small surrenders that go unnoticed until one day you wake up in a life that does not feel like your own. And by then, you may have built so much around it. Career, relationships, identity, that the thought of unraveling any of it feels unbearable. But this is precisely where the soul begins to ache. Not in the dramatic upheavals, but in the quiet repetition of days that do not reflect who you are. The misalignment between the life you live and the life that calls to you becomes a source of chronic tension. It is a tension you may not even have words for. Only a persistence that something isn't right, that something vital has been left behind. You might feel this in the moments when you are alone and the silence becomes too loud. You might feel it when you are celebrated for something and yet feel no joy. You might feel it in your body, as a dull resistance to waking, a heaviness in your limbs, a vague yearning you cannot name. These are not weaknesses. These are signals. They are the psyche's way of telling you that the life you are living is too small for the truth of who you are. And yet, many people continue. They push these signals aside, rationalize them, bury them beneath obligations. They say, this is just how life is, and they keep walking the path that was never truly theirs. But the unconscious does not forget. It holds on to the unlived life, stores it in dreams and symptoms, in restlessness. The longer it is ignored, the more insistent it becomes, and eventually it will demand to be heard. You see, to live by default is not to live at all. It is to exist within a structure built by other people's hopes, fears, and limitations, and though it may provide security, it does not provide meaning. Meaning can only be found through conscious engagement. With your desires, your wounds, your purpose. It can only be found by asking yourself not just what the world expects of you, but what your soul longs for. This is not an easy task. It requires immense courage to question the foundations of your life. To ask, what have I chosen and what have I merely accepted? To face the possibility that much of what you have built may need to be reimagined, redefined, or even released. But to avoid that task is to trade vitality for comfort, truth for familiarity. And no soul can thrive in such an arrangement. There is a moment in every journey when the individual must decide whether to continue living someone else's story or to begin writing their own. That moment is sacred. It is not a crisis. It is an awakening. And though it may come with pain, it also comes with possibility. The possibility of finally living in alignment with who you truly are, not who you were told to be. If your life feels foreign to you, if it seems like you are walking a path that was never really yours, it is not because you have failed. It is because you are finally beginning to see. There is a particular kind of weight that many carry, one not visible to the eye and yet as real as any stone. It is the burden of misalignment, the heaviness of living in a way that does not reflect one's deepest truths. And this weight, though subtle, has profound consequences. It weaves itself into our thoughts, our relationships, our bodies. It is a quiet pressure that never fully lifts, no matter how well we perform, how much we achieve, or how many people we please. To live in misalignment is to move through the world while denying some essential part of who you are. Perhaps it is your creativity, long suppressed in favor of practicality. Perhaps it is your voice, silenced to maintain peace, or your beliefs, softened to avoid rejection. At first, such sacrifices may seem small, necessary even, but over time each act of disconnection becomes a thread in the net that entangles the soul. This net becomes the invisible architecture of our suffering. We do not always see it directly, but we feel its pull. We feel it when we say yes while everything in us wants to say no. We feel it when we engage in work that drains us, when we speak words that are not ours, when we stay in places we have long outgrown. The body remembers. The psyche remembers, and both begin to revolt. Not in rebellion, but in symptom. Many come to me and say, I don't understand why I feel so tired, so anxious, so distant from my own life. And I listen not only to their words, but to the gaps in between, the things unsaid, the truths deferred. Often, What emerges is not a problem to be solved, but a misalignment to be named. They have constructed lives that may be functional, even admirable, but which fail to nourish the very core of their being. Misalignment is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself with catastrophe. Sometimes, it is the quiet compromise made every day. The art left uncreated, the boundaries never set. The self abandoned in order to keep the peace. It is the subtle self-betrayal that says, "This is not quite right, but I will keep going anyway." And in this, we lose a little of ourselves again and again. The cost of this is immense. When the outer life does not reflect the inner life, we become strangers to ourselves. We may still function, still fulfill roles, still meet expectations, but we do so at a distance from our essence. Over time, this creates a kind of psychic fatigue, a slow erosion of aliveness. Joy becomes fleeting. Peace becomes conditional. The sense of meaning that once animated us begins to fade. And yet, the world rarely recognizes this kind of suffering. It rewards appearance. It rewards compliance. It tells us that if things look good from the outside, they must be good. But the soul is not fooled by appearances. It knows when it has been exiled. It knows when it has been edited for the comfort of others. And it will speak. Not always in words, but through dreams, through restlessness, through that persistent ache we try so hard to ignore. We must learn to listen to that ache, not as a problem, but as a message. It is not there to punish us. It is there to guide us back. The discomfort of misalignment is the psyche's way of signaling that we have strayed from ourselves. And like a compass, it will keep pointing us home, no matter how far we wander. But the journey back requires courage. For to realign one's life is to make choices that may disrupt the illusion of safety. It is to risk disappointing others, to face uncertainty, to walk a path that is not yet paved. But what is the alternative? To remain in a life that fits you only at the surface, to continue bearing a weight that was never yours to carry, to trade authenticity for acceptance and vitality for comfort. That is not living. It is enduring, and the soul was not made to endure. It was made to express, to unfold, to become. When we begin to live in alignment, something remarkable happens. The weight begins to lift, not all at once, but gradually. We begin to feel more present, more honest, more alive, not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes truer. And in truth, there is great relief. In truth, there is rest. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of finally no longer pretending. So if you feel a heaviness you cannot explain, do not rush to numb it or push it away. Sit with it. Ask it what it knows. Let it show you where you have compromised, where you have shrunk, where you have drifted from yourself, and then gently begin the return. There is a grief that often goes unnamed, unspoken, and therefore unloved. It is not the grief of death or loss in the traditional sense, but the quiet sorrow for the life one did not live. This is a sorrow that visits us in still moments, in the spaces between doing and becoming, in the silence that arises when the distractions fall away. It is the grief of potential abandoned, not because of failure, but because of neglect, fear, or simply the absence of choice. Each of us carries within a multitude of possibilities. Different versions of the self, different paths, different stories we might have lived. These unlived lives do not simply vanish because we chose otherwise, or because life pulled us in a certain direction. No, they linger within the psyche, like ghosts. They exist in the background, quietly watching, silently waiting. And though we may pretend not to notice them, the soul is aware of their presence. There is pain in looking at what might have been. And so many avoid it. We focus on what is, on what we have managed to build, often with great effort. We tell ourselves that it is ungrateful to wonder about other lives, that we should be content with what we have. But the soul does not respond to logic in this way. It is not bound by convention or politeness. It grieves not because it wants more in a greedy sense, but because something true was never allowed to be born. Sometimes this grief shows itself as regret, sharp, cutting, and full of stories that begin with, "What if?" Other times it shows itself as a dull ache, a quiet restlessness that lives just beneath the surface. It may come as envy when we see someone else living freely, or as longing when we read about those who dared to pursue their inner calling. And often, it comes without words. Just a heaviness, a sense of something missing. To grieve an unlived life is not indulgent. It is a necessary form of honesty. It is the soul's way of honoring what was real, even if it was never actualized. And until we allow ourselves to feel this grief, we remain haunted by what we avoid. The paradox is that in facing this sorrow, we actually make space for healing. In acknowledging what could not be, we come closer to what still can be. People often confuse this kind of grief with dissatisfaction or immaturity. They say, move on, or be grateful for what you have. And while gratitude is important, it must never be used to silence the truth. You can be grateful for your life and still mourn the parts of you that were never lived. These two things are not in opposition. In fact, they must coexist if we are to live fully. In my work, I have seen that the unlived life often contains essential aspects of the self. Creativity, freedom, love, authenticity. That could not find expression in the life we were given or the choices we felt we had to make. And if we never turn toward those aspects, we risk becoming rigid, bitter, or numb. We may lose touch with vitality, not because it is gone, but because it was buried beneath years of pretending. This does not mean we must abandon everything and start anew. Sometimes that is neither possible nor necessary. But it does mean we must begin to make space for what was lost. To ask, is there still room for this part of me? Can I bring even a piece of that unlived life into the present? Often, the answer is yes, if we are willing to be honest and brave. It is also worth saying that the life we did not choose is not always one of beauty. Sometimes we are haunted not just by unlived dreams, but by unhealed wounds, by choices we were too afraid to make, by relationships we stayed in too long, by truths we avoided. And in these cases, too, grief is necessary. Not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. Because what we do not grieve, we carry. And what we carry unconsciously begins to shape us in ways we do not see. The task is to sit with this grief, not to analyze it endlessly, but to feel it, to let it soften us instead of harden us, to let it teach us what still matters. For in the ashes of the life we did not live, there is often the seed of the life that still calls to us. Not the same dream, perhaps, but the same essence. And that essence does not expire with time. It waits. So, if you feel a sorrow you cannot quite name, if you sense something missing but cannot explain what it is, consider this. Perhaps you are mourning not a mistake, but a part of yourself that was never given room to exist. There comes a time when the soul, burdened and worn thin by years of silence, begins to stir with quiet rebellion. It may not announce itself loudly, nor does it always arrive with clarity, but there is a shift, subtle, insistent, undeniable. And in that shift, one begins to question not just what life has become, but what it could be if one dared to listen more deeply. Not to the noise of the world, not to the endless voices of duty or performance, but to deeper whisper of one's own being. This moment, though often experienced as confusion or unease, is sacred. It is the beginning of awakening. For much of life, we are taught to look outward for direction. We are trained to seek approval, to follow maps drawn by others, to measure our worth by how well we conform. And for a time, this may suffice. But there comes a point when the external structure begins to collapse under the weight of inner contradiction. The soul, having been shaped and reshaped to fit the expectations of others, begins to recoil. It no longer tolerates what is false. And what was once tolerable becomes unbearable. This is the first sign that change is near. Not always dramatic, not always immediate, but inevitable. The masks grow heavier, the roles more suffocating. The excuses, this is just how things are, or I don't have a choice, begin to lose their power. And even if the mind clings to the familiar, something deeper knows it. The cost of staying asleep is now greater than the risk of waking up. Yet this awakening does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, like light creeping into a dark room. First, we begin to notice what feels off. Certain conversations, obligations, even ways of thinking. We feel a dissonance between who we pretend to be and who we truly are. And that dissonance becomes a question, who am I really beneath all this performance? The answer does not come in words, not immediately. It comes through discomfort, through dreams, through restlessness. It comes when we stop numbing ourselves long enough to feel the full weight of our dissatisfaction. It comes when we finally admit, even quietly, something about this isn't right. And then, slowly, a path begins to form. Not a path that leads us back to the old life with new strategies, but a path that leads us inward. We begin to realize that authenticity is not something we find out there. It is something we uncover, something we remember. Beneath the layers of adaptation and survival is a self that never disappeared, only dimmed. That self is not loud or demanding. It waits patiently for us to turn toward it with honesty and tenderness. What many fear is that if they begin to follow that voice, they will have to give up everything: relationships, careers, but the structure of their lives. But this is rarely true. The call is not necessarily to destroy, but to realign. It asks not for recklessness, but for courage. And courage, here, means being willing to live without the certainty of approval. It means being willing to disappoint others in order to remain in truth. This is not selfishness. It is integrity, for we do not serve the world by living in falsehood. We do not inspire others by pretending to be who we are not. The greatest gift we can offer is our own wholeness. Not perfection, not performance, but presence. And presence only arises when we are no longer at war with ourselves. To awaken is to begin the lifelong process of remembering what was forgotten. It is to notice where we abandoned ourselves and to return. It is to say, this is what I need. This is what I value. This is what feels true to me, even when the world insists otherwise. And in that return, we reclaim not just energy or motivation, but meaning. Some will not understand this journey. Some will resist it, especially those who benefited from your sleep. But their resistance is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to your soul, to your inner life, to the sacred task of becoming who you truly are. That task does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with small choices. Telling the truth, setting a boundary, making space for what matters. Each choice, however small, becomes an anchor in a world that often seeks to pull you away from yourself. And so, when the moment comes, and it will, when the ache of disconnection becomes louder than the fear of change, listen. Not to the noise, but to the quiet within. For that quiet contains everything you have been looking for. The question eventually arises: can we ever truly come back to ourselves after so many years spent away? After decades of living through masks, performing roles, fulfilling obligations that were never quite our own, is it still possible to return to what is real within us? And not just return in thought, but to live from that place again, fully, unashamedly, courageously. The psyche is remarkably resilient. Though it may retreat under pressure, distort itself to survive, or grow quiet under the strain of disconnection, it does not forget who it is. It watches, it waits. Even when we abandon it, it does not abandon us. The deepest truths within us may be buried, may be silenced, but they are not destroyed. What is essential does not die. It goes underground into the unconscious, into dream and symptom and symbol. And it waits for the moment when we are strong enough, or desperate enough, to reclaim it. Reclaiming the self is not the same as restoring an old version of who we were. Often, that version was already shaped by external forces, already partially adapted to please or survive. No, what we speak of here is deeper than nostalgia. It is the emergence of a self that may never had the chance to exist fully in the outer world. It is not so much a return as it is a homecoming. Coming home, finally, to a self that is both ancient and new. To begin this process, we must turn inward with radical honesty. We must ask, without judgment, where did I lose myself? At what point did I begin to live in service of something other than truth? Was it when I chose safety over creativity? Belonging over honesty? Acceptance over freedom? These questions are not to indict, but to illuminate. For we all make these choices, not of weakness, but out of necessity. But there comes a time when necessity becomes imprisonment, and we must find the courage to break free. It is not always easy to reclaim the self. Often, there is guilt. We may grieve the years spent in disconnection, mourn the parts of us that were sacrificed. We may worry about how others will respond, about the lives that have been built upon the version of us we are now outgrowing. And yet, none of this negates the need for the return. The true self does not ask us to burn everything down. It asks only that we live in alignment with what is now true, even if that truth has changed. Many think this path will bring immediate relief, that authenticity will replace suffering with joy. But in truth, the early stages of returning to the self are often marked by discomfort. What was once numb becomes raw. What was once hidden becomes exposed. Old patterns resist change. Old identities cling tightly. We may feel lost, uncertain, even more tired than before. But this tiredness is different. It is the exhaustion that comes from tearing down illusions, from confronting what we have long denied. Over time, however, something shifts. In place of performance, there is presence. In place of anxiety, there is clarity. The energy once spent maintaining the false self becomes available again. Reclaimed, reintegrated. The soul begins to breathe more freely. We feel more alive not because life becomes perfect, but because we are finally inhabiting it with truth. Reclaiming the self also means reclaiming responsibility, not the burdensome kind handed to us by society, but the sacred kind, the responsibility to our own becoming. We are no longer children waiting for someone else to tell us who we are. We are adults, wounded perhaps, but not broken, who now have the power to choose, to shape, to respond. And in this power, there is great liberation. Let us be clear, returning to the self is not a luxury. It is not an indulgence. It is a necessity for the soul. For when we live as strangers to ourselves, we cannot truly connect to others, nor to the world. All meaningful relationship begins with inner alignment. When we are whole within, we relate from wholeness. When we are honest within, we speak with integrity. When we are grounded in our own truth, we are less easily swayed by the noise of the world. And perhaps most importantly, returning to the self is not a one-time act. It is a continual unfolding. Life will pull us away again and again. We will forget, we will adapt, we will stray. But if we remain committed to the inner life, if we continue to listen deeply, we can return again and again. And each return deepens our connection to something unshakable. So when the moment arrives, and it will, when you find yourself standing at the edge of your old life, unsure of who you are or where to go, remember this: you are not lost. You are remembering.